before we let you in from the waiting room, and I am just delighted to hear the kind of numbers of people who come to these programs, and now particularly that you are online, that you have people really from all over the country, and I'm hoping in the year ahead that maybe we can have some opportunity at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, to partner with the CSP, and eventually we'll have the whole alphabet. But I think that it's very admirable that all of you, I guess in California in particular, are spending your lunchtime learning Torah. So it's all good. I wanted today to particularly focus on material that will enhance your Seder, which is to say, I'm going to share Midrashim stories, 3 levels of stories that are not found in the traditional Passover Haggadah. The point here being that year in, year out, you come, you sit around the table, you read the script, as it were, of the Haggadah, and the Mishnah, the earliest document of Rabbinic Judaism from around the year 200, the Mishnah tells us that the mitzvah of being at a Seder is Kol hamisaper b'yatziat Mitzrayim, Kol hamarbeh l'saper b'yatziat Mitzrayim, hareze mishubach. The more that you expand the story of the Exodus, the better. It's such a great event that we want to dilate on it. And as I said yesterday, kind of the ideal Seder is one that goes on and on. When I first came to New York City right out of college, I was invited by the dean of the rabbinical school, may he rest in peace, the late Neil Gilman, to come to his Seder. And for the first time in my life, I was at a Seder that went until 2 a.m. And I thought this was quite remarkable. And then I went to walk home. And I went out on West End Avenue. For those of you that don't know New York City, West End Avenue has a density of population roughly equivalent to Jerusalem. My French colleagues refer to West End Avenue as the Rue de la Paix, or something like that. But I walk out, it's 2 in the morning. I'm prepared, of course, to see a Jew or two on the street in the wee hours and say good Yontif. And wasn't I shocked to see West End just packed with Jews, not only coming from one Seder, but on their way to another Seder that they knew ran even later. So I'm hoping to give you some material for your Seder, some stories about the rabbis, and I want to start with a story about the rabbis that is in the Haggadah. We read a story about a Seder in Bnei Brak, where we are told that Robbie Eliezer ben Azariah, Robbie Hoshua, Robbie Akiva, Robbie Tarfon, and Robbie Eliezer sat all night at their Seder. So 5 rabbis are named. As I mentioned last night in symposium literature, it's quite de rigueur to mention 4 or 5 names of very famous rabbis. I suspect that most of you will recognize the name Robbie Akiva. And I will not tell Robbie Akiva stories, but I do want to give a plug for a colleague, my colleague Barry Holtz, just in this last year, brought out a book on Robbie Akiva. So if you want to read something good on Robbie Akiva, read Barry Holtz. He's one of the premier Jewish educators. And I hope, Ari, that you will have him on CSP if you haven't already. But I want to start with this story. I'm going to tell some stories about the rabbis. Then I'm going to tell a story about someone who's conspicuously absent in the Haggadah. And then I'm going to tell you some Midrashim on some parts of the Haggadah. So the first rabbi I want to talk about is Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, I identify with him very strongly because, as it were, he went to public school as a kid. He did not grow up, as we would say, a ben Torah. His father seemed to have been a secular Jew, not particularly observant. His father had a big farm, and the farm was big enough, and this is unusual in Roman Palestine, as the story goes, that his father could actually employ other people, not members of the family, to go out and plow his fields. of course, he was a good dad, so he made sure that young Eliezer, and when I say young Eliezer, let me tell a little bit more of the story, and then we can figure out just how old Eliezer is. But he made sure that Robbie Eliezer learned the job of running a farm from the ground up. So, Robbie Eliezer is there handling the plow one day, and this may be a interesting sign of his rabbinate to come. Rather than plow, he sits down on the furrow and begins to cry. His father comes over to him and says, Eliezer, what's the story? Maybe this furrow is too rocky for you. Why don't you go plow over there? It's been plowed more. It'll be easier. Robbie Eliezer goes over to the next furrow where it's nicely plowed, picks up the plow handle, and no sooner does it get into his hands, then he sits on the ground and starts to cry. His father says, Eliezer, what's going on here? And Eliezer says memorably, Dad, I want to learn Torah. So at this point, of course, the audience all applauds. Our hero has entered the stage. We know he wants to learn Torah. And his father says, you want to learn Torah? You want to go to Hebrew school? Get married, have a kid, take him to Hebrew school. Which is how we actually know that Eliezer's father really is Jewish. He is hungry for grandchildren, but Eliezer's not having any of it. And again, in an act of great maturity, he sits down on the ground, he starts to cry, and then finally, he cries long enough that the prophet Elijah appears to him. Now, I just want to say for the record that if you go long enough, and in the case of the narrative about Robbie Eliezer, not only did he cry, but he went without eating, that if you fast and you cry, Elijah really will appear to you. And odds are very good that when Elijah does appear to you in those circumstances, the prophet Eliyahu will say exactly what you wish him to say to you, because you are obviously having a hallucination. This is unlike, of course, what's going to happen at all of your starim, because on Friday night, April the 15th, at a certain point in the Seder, you will open your door and Elijah will come in. And then he may or may not say what you want to hear. But in the case of Robbie Eliezer, Elijah says to him, Eliezer, you want to learn Torah? Go up to Jerusalem, and there you can study with Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, this is quite something, because first of all, it entails Eliezer leaving home and going to Jerusalem. Second of all, it tells us as listeners something we didn't know before, because if Yochanan ben Zakkai is in Jerusalem, we know when the story should be taking place. We know there's a very famous story of Yochanan ben Zakkai sneaking out of Jerusalem when it was under siege. And that is in the first rebellion against Rome, 66 to 70. So the story I'm telling you now about Eliezer ben Hyrcanus has to take place before that. So let's put this story somewhere in the early 60s. And when I say 60s, I don't mean of the 20th century, and I'm looking around, a lot of you have nostalgia for the early 60s, but I mean the 60s of the first century. So Eliezer goes and he gets to Yochanan ben Zakkai's academy. And Yochanan says, what's your name? And Eliezer won't tell him. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon, because when you go to a school and the master of the school asks you your name, you would think that one would immediately respond. And when I ask my rabbinical students, what do they think is going on, I generally get two responses. One is that Eliezer's actually nervous, that if he says who he is, Yochanan will send him back home. He's a runaway, after all. The other is that he's not just any runaway. He is the son of a very wealthy father. And I know this from some cousins, that if your father is very wealthy, people tend to treat you differently than they treat other people. I think it's somewhere in the books of the prophets, it says, the very rich are not like you and me. So Eliezer is shtum. He doesn't say anything. And Yochanan says, so what do you know? And it turns out Eliezer knows nothing. So Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I will teach you the Shema, the Amidah, and Birkat HaMazon. I will teach you how to recite those 3 biblical paragraphs of the Shema. I will teach you how to pray the rabbinic prayer, the Amidah, also known as the Shemona Esrei, the 18 prayers. And I will teach you how to recite grace after meals. Now, in saying this, Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is to say the storyteller of the story, is giving us a very good window. What are the basic things we should expect any Jew who has some degree of shul knowledge? What are the things they know? And you'd like them to know how to go into a synagogue, how to say the Shema, which we say daily, how to say the Amidah, which we say daily, and how to say Birkat HaMazon, because we shouldn't eat without expressing gratitude for our food. Indeed, there's even Birkat HaMazon in the Passover Haggadah. So he teaches him, it says, 2 halachot every day. That probably means some proto-Mishnah. He teaches him 2 rabbinic laws every day, and Eliezer recites them by memory until umidabkan. He has them like glue. They stick to him. On Shabbat, he reviews. So every Shabbat, he learns the dozen new halachot that he learned during the week. I think I did the math right, 6 times 2. And he's starting to learn Torah. But every day, as Yochanan teaches him oral Torah, they're literally face to face, Yochanan ben Zakkai can't help but notice that Eliezer ben Hyrcanus has very bad breath. In fact, every day I almost imagine Yochanan ben Zakkai standing a little further away, because face it, the kid's breath reeks. Why does his breath reek? Because he hasn't been eating. So Yochanan says, did you have lunch? And Eliezer says, thanks, I had lunch today. So then Yochanan says, who are you staying with? And he names some of the rabbis he's staying with. Yochanan sends them a message and says, did Eliezer eat with you? And they say, no, in fact, it's been 8 days since he's eaten. So now he calls Eliezer ben Hyrcanus back and he says, okay, we've been studying Torah. Obviously, there's something not right here because you haven't been eating. I don't think you have a food disorder, which means that you probably wish you could eat, but you don't have money for food. Who is your father? And at that point, Eliezer finally owns up. He says, my father is Hyrcanus. And Yochanan gives a very, very disappointing response to that. When Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great rabbi of Jerusalem, hears that Eliezer's father is a very wealthy man, he says, Hello, ben Gedoleo, lamata v'lo hayita magidli? Your father's this wealthy person, and you didn't let me know? Hayom matasoed etzli. We'll have lunch together at my house today. At which point Eliezer says, no, thank you. So now we learn that indeed Eliezer anticipated this response. And he maybe even anticipated that the head of any kind of a Jewish educational institution, I'm looking at you, Ari, is always trying to find funding. And funding is a hard thing. I know this from the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Any of you know it from your own synagogues. Getting the funding to keep doing the work is very important. And Yochanan is focused on that. In the meantime, now they know. They know that Hyrcanus is the father. They know that Eliezer is not just any student. He's very bright. And so Yochanan sends a note to Hyrcanus and says, we're having a gala. We'd love you to be one of the guests of honor. Hyrcanus shows up. And who's giving the Devar Torah? Who is giving the sermonette? Of course, it's Hyrcanus. It's Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And now, of course, is the moment of truth. Because Hyrcanus could say, he ran away. He left me with the plow in my hand. I'm disowning him. But in fact, what Hyrcanus says is, wow, I'm so proud of you. You're doing such a wonderful job. And at this point, of course, we can cue the violins. The birds start chirping in the background. I'm sure Yochanan Ben Zakkai is already imagining the Hirkanus library. And Eliezer and his father have rapprochement, and his father, the Am Haaretz, now becomes a supporter of Torah. So that's our first story of a rabbi, a great rabbi, a leader in the Jewish community, who started really not knowing anything, who came from a secular home, but through his achievement in Torah and his willingness literally to starve to learn Torah, that rewards him richly and greatly. And of course, the greatest reward for all rabbinic readers is that even his secular father comes and starts attending sessions of the community scholar program. So this is a they lived happily ever after moment. I mentioned another rabbi, though, and he's an interesting bird. His name is Elazar ben Azariah. And some of you may remember that in the Passover Haggadah, this time I don't have to get up, I put it right where I can grab it. In the Passover Haggadah, Elazar ben Azariah says something interesting. He says, first I'll quote it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it. Harei ani keben shivim shana. I'm about 70 years old. Velo zachiti shetei amer yetziat Mitzrayim balaylot. And I never merited to understand why we tell the story of the Exodus at nighttime. Now, in the context of the Haggadah, it sounds like Elazar ben Azariah is going to teach us why we do a Seder at nighttime rather than at lunchtime. I mean, after all, a lot of our custom around the table is lunchtime custom. We do Rosh Hashanah lunch after Shul. We do Shabbos lunch after Shul. But here, we're doing the Seder, and there's a whole ritual at nighttime. And Elazar ben Azariah indeed explains how we learn to say the Haggadah, the narrative, Haggadah narrative, at night. And maybe tomorrow I'll touch on that when we actually study some of the Haggadah text. The main part of the Haggadah, which is the mitzvah of recitation, is chock full of Midrash. And frankly, it tends to be rather opaque for most readers. You read it, you get through it, and you don't understand a word you said. So tomorrow, I'm going to try and unpack the Haggadah text so that you see how the rabbis are weaving a story, a narrative around the Exodus and expanding the narrative as they themselves recite by memory the story of the Exodus. But for today, I want to tell you something about Elazar ben Azariah because he says something so curious. He says, I'm about 70 years old. Now, last October, I turned 70. And ever since then, I've been walking around telling everyone who will listen, Harei ani shivim shana. I am 70 years old because I know exactly when my birthday is. I know exactly how old I am. And I have had great merit. I have richly benefited from the 50 years I have been studying Torah at JTS. So I wonder, what's the deal? Does Elazar ben Azariah not know his birthday? All right, maybe they didn't keep great records back then. After all, when he was born, he was very young. He didn't exactly know which day it was. Maybe as people grew older, he got a little dementia, and he couldn't really quite keep track of what year it is, how old he was anymore. But no, there's actually a story about how Elazar ben Azariah was like 70 years old. The truth of the matter was, he was somewhere between 17 and 18 years old when he made this statement. Wow, he was a virile young man. So what's the story? The story, this I know will come as a shock to you, takes place around an argument between two Jews. I know, Jews never, ever argue with one another. There's never been disagreement in the history of the Jewish community. But in this particular case, there was a debate about how we say the evening service. Is the evening service, Mariv, is it optional Or is it in fact a halachic requirement? And rabbis disagree with one another on this. And unfortunately, the way the rabbis disagree, Rabban Gamliel disagrees with someone who's very much his senior, Rabbi Yehoshua. And Rabban Gamliel publicly embarrasses Rabbi Yehoshua just because they disagree about this. And as a result of the public disagreements, the other rabbis are so angered at Rabban Gamliel that they depose him from office. They throw him out. He was supposed to be the head of the Jewish community, and they basically force him to resign. But now they have a dilemma. Who should we replace him with? Well, the obvious person to replace him with would be Rabbi Yehoshua. But Rabbi Yehoshua is the other side of the argument. So they say, nah, not a good idea. If he's the other side of the argument, it looks too political. So then they say, ooh, what about Robbie Akiva? We all know Robbie Akiva. We read Barry Holtz's book. It's terrific. No, you can't do Robbie Akiva. Why? Because Akiva did not come from a rabbinic family. Akiva came from almost no background. And the rabbis are nervous that they don't want someone leading the Jewish community in a very patrician Roman world who has no yichus, who has no family to protect him. So they finally settle on Elazar ben Azariah. Shehu chacham, he is a sage, he's smart. Vehu ashir, and while we're at it, he's wealthy. Vehu asiri le'ezra, and he can trace his family back to the Bible. His 10th great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Ezra, who has his own book in the Bible. So Elazar ben Azariah is a really good choice. They ask Elazar ben Azariah, will you now lead the Jewish community? And Elazar demonstrates his brilliance, his political savvy, by saying one thing that every man should learn to say. He says, I need to talk with my wife about this. It's so smart. I mean, I must say from my own personal experience that I have benefited endlessly from taking my wife's advice. I don't always take it, but at least I talk with my wife about it. And of course, it buys you a little time so that overnight you can think, do I want to do this? Don't I want to do this? So he goes to his wife and he tells her what has happened. And she says, you know, you're really young. You don't even have gray hair in your beard. How are you going to be the leader of the Jewish community? Nobody is going to respect you. And he says, today's my day. I'm going to grab the gold ring. Actually, what he says in Aramaic is, I'm going to grab the goblet and let it be smashed tomorrow. So he comes back to the rabbis and he says, I'm going to take the job. And a miracle occurred. The miracle occurred. He wasn't on the job one day and his beard turned gray. Now, some people think it's a miracle. I have to tell you, I often send my rabbinical students out. They're ordained a rabbi. They're in their mid-20s. They go out. They take their first congregation. I see them a year later, and they're completely gray. This happens when you become a rabbi in the field. So, it is a miracle. But this is what allowed Elazar ben Azariah to say, I'm like a person who's 70 years old. He wasn't actually 70, but he did have a gray beard. So, Elazar, by the way, gives the reason that we say the Haggadah at night. I'm going to stick with that. In the Haggadah, it sounds like Elazar is giving the reason that we say the Haggadah at night, because there is a verse in the Torah that says we should recite the story of the Exodus all the days of our life. And Elazar reasons, if it said the days of our life, then we would know that we had to have a Seder in the daytime. But the fact that it says all the days of our life, that extra word, all, that comes to include the nighttime too. And that's why we have a Seder at nighttime. If you like that, I also have a bridge I can sell you. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to not only tell you some stories about our rabbis, and I've just told you a story about Eliezer, and I've told you a story about Elazar ben Azariah, and we mentioned Rabbi Yehoshua and Robbie Akiva. But there is a person who is virtually absent in the story of the Exodus that we tell on Seder night. He's virtually not mentioned in the Haggadah. And yet, if you read the Torah text, it's all about Moshe. Did you ever wonder about that, that we don't mention Moshe on Seder night? How could we overlook him? That seems like such a slight. I always imagine Moshe in the world to come saying, oh, another Seder, and they forgot about me. And maybe that's what it means when it says in the Torah that Moses was among the most humble of people on earth, that he could bear it. He could bear the fact that we ignore him. I think, and if anyone disagrees with me, I'd love to hear what you think. I think the reason we ignore Moses, our teacher, on Seder night is that the focus is entirely on HaKodesh Baruch Hu Bichvodo Ba'atzmo. We focus on God. God redeemed us. God in person, God and the Jews. It's all about God. It's about our relationship with God. And it reminds us that if we are in a covenant with God, well, God already did God's part of the covenant. God took us out of Egypt. So I think the emphasis is God, 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 rather than talk about Moshe, who is, after all, a mere human being. Does anyone have a different theory? Ari might be able to see if you raise a hand. Avis Miller, raised hand.
Okay, I've unmuted her.
Anti-Christian polemic.
Anti-Christian polemic, 3 words, which is to say, can you unpack it a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, this is the time of the Haggadah is the early years of Christianity, and Jesus is seen as an intermediary between God and the Jewish people, and the Jews didn't want Moshe to kind of take that obvious role. They wanted to unseat Jesus from that role. Also, I think, and this is just to be humorous, Moshe says to God, "Remove me from your book." Well, in the Haggadah, he gets his wish.
Okay, Avis Miller, where are you calling in from?
Chevy Chase, Maryland.
Yes, where Rabbi Miller spent a glorious career leading the Jewish community, and I'm so pleased that you're on this call. So thank you. And after Marga gives her theory, I'll come back and respond to both of you. Can we unmute Marga?
No, here I am. I was just having
There you
cursor
are.
problems. I want to say I love Avis's explanation. I just want to say that at the same time, there are Midrashim that almost suggest Moshe as an alternate to Jesus. Midrashim about that when he was born, light filled the room and so forth, and you can almost imagine him lying in a manger. So there's clearly a tension over putting Moshe, over elevating him in the intermediary role, but in the final word on the Haggadah was not to do it, perhaps.
Okay, and Sheffy, do you want to comment on that, or you have your own theory? Neither nor. All right, so let me comment on what Avis and Marga have to say, because I think there might well be something to it, which is to say that we demote Moses because there is a stream within Jewish narrative that elevates Moses almost to God-like characteristic. It might well be that we elevate Moses to be an opposition figure to Jesus. In other words, by the time the rabbis are telling the story, they know of Jesus not as I often say, the story of Jesus of Nazareth, right? that people had a rabbi and they crucified him. Well, that's hardly news. That happens all the time in the Jewish community. But I think that when the rabbis saw Jesus, they saw Jesus truly as a figure who worried them, because Christianity, after all, became the empire and ultimately persecuted the Jews. So there is good reason to set Moses up in opposition. The only thing that makes me hesitate is a Jewish work which has been preserved for us in Greek, not in Hebrew, but we know the origins of the work were in Hebrew. It's called The Wisdom of Solomon. It's probably 200 or 300 years before Christianity. And in that, there is another figure who takes the Jews out of Egypt. There's one line in the Torah that says, God says, I sent my angel before you. And a lot of the rabbis assume my angel, my messenger, meant Moshe. But in the Wisdom of Solomon, in Greek, we have Pantodunimos Logos, the all-powerful Word of God. And the Word of God incarnate leaps off God's throne, comes down and takes the Jews out of Egypt. So there may be some opposition to any kind of intermediation, be it Christian intermediation or not. And I think that there is a desire to minimize Moses. On the other hand, you all know that Pharaoh and his soothsayers were threatened by Moses. Pharaoh had heard that someone would dethrone him. And little did he believe that the boy, his anacle, his grandson, oh my God, his adopted grandson, who his daughter adopted, she took him out of the river one day. And I'm sure Pharaoh was thinking, she really expects me to believe that story? She found the baby in the river and now she's bringing him home? All right, I won't ask any questions, right? So Pharaoh's daughter, Bitya, brings home this baby, and Pharaoh is playing with him one day in his peck and play. And Pharaoh, as he's playing, Pharaoh's crown falls off of his head into the peck and play, in the playpen. And Moses, sure enough, baby Moses, immediately reaches for the crown and tries to put it on his head. Oh my God, what a horrible thing that would be, because then Pharaoh would know that it's his own grandson who will depose him. So the angel Gabriel intercedes. And in the other corner of the playpen, he throws a burning coal. And Moses looks over at the glowing coal and he says, ooh, that looks neat. And so instead of grabbing the crown, baby Moses crawls over and gavot! He picks up the burning coal. Of course it burns his hand. And no sooner does it burn his hand than, like anybody who gets a burn, the first thing he does is pops it in his mouth. And it burns his mouth. And that's why we know from the Torah that Moses always says he was of thick mouth, heavy of speech. He had a speech impediment. And now we know the story, how Moshe got that speech impediment, because he got it so that that would be his, if you will, enabling wound. God saved his life by virtue of that burn. And now we have Moses. There are other characters in the biblical story as well. You know that there are the midwives. And the rabbis often identify these otherwise anonymous heroines, these wonderful women. They like to put names and places together. So they say they weren't just any midwives, that the midwives who saved the Jewish boys, we know their names. Their names were, wait for it, Miriam and Yocheved. So now we know that Moses' family is famous from A to Z. His sister, his mother, they were the midwives, they took care, and Pharaoh now can start to do his work, and we know the story in Exodus. Pharaoh says, these Jews, I'm actually quoting Exodus now, they breed like vermin. You hear how he demeans the Jews before he tries to destroy them? That's in the biblical story. I think it's a very keen insight on how we view our enemy before we try and destroy them. He says they breed like vermin. I'm going to put them together, put them to work. They'll make bricks. I'll give them straw. I'll give them mud. And you know what? They don't meet my quota. So I'm going to ask them to sleep on the job site so they can get up at sunrise, work till it's dark, sleep on the job site, and then go back to making bricks. Of course, Pharaoh doesn't have to say out loud that if he does that, they won't have a lot of time to make baby Jews because they won't be there with their wives and they'll be exhausted every day. And the Midrash goes further to say that the Jewish women of that era, what did they do? As the sun began to set, they put on their makeup, put on a little perfume, packed a picnic lunch, went and found their husbands at the work site exhausted and said, honey, I made a special dinner for you. And they would take them out into the wilderness, feed them, give them some wine, and show them a good evening so that the Jews could continue to propagate. And that is why the women of Egypt were so celebrated, because they knew how to get around Pharaoh's strictures. But Pharaoh was no fool, the Midrash says. Pharaoh knew that the Jews of Egypt were really pious Jews and that they wouldn't have sex if they didn't go to the mikvah. I always laugh when I read this because, first of all, it's amazing to me that the rabbis could ever imagine that Pharaoh would know the rules of mikvah, let alone that they would imagine that the women who were slaves in Egypt knew the rules of mikvah, which weren't given until hundreds of years later. And it does make us wonder, American Jews, whose women don't often go to the mikvah, whether we would have been redeemed. But Pharaoh, that nasty man, he said, I know what to do. The women purify their blood by going to the mikvah and immersing in 40 gallons of water. I'm going to shut the water. And he turned the bell, and now the mikvah no longer had water. So how did God punish them? Measure for measure. If Pharaoh turned off the water to keep the Jews from purifying their blood, God turned the Nile into blood. I read today with a student that the miracle of the water turning to blood was a daily occurrence, so much so that Egyptians thought they could game it. So they would go into a Jewish home and they would say, I'm thirsty, can you give me some water? Thinking, well, the Jews have water, we don't. And the Jew would fill the, as it were, the cup from the tap, from the well, and it would be pure water, and he would hand it to the Egyptian, and no sooner did it get in the Egyptian's hand than it turned to blood. So the Egyptians thought, oh, this is terrible, now what am I going to do? They said to the Jews, you know, maybe we could share the glass of water. You take a sip, I'll take a sip, you take a sip, I'll take a sip. The Jew said, I'm not so sure that's so hygienic. And the Egyptian said, well, hygienic or not, you're the slave, I'm the master, that's what we're going to do. So the Jew took a sip of pure, clean water, handed the same cup to the Egyptian. The Egyptian quaffed it and found his mouth filled with blood. Blah. So that's the plague of blood. The rabbis suggest that when God took the plagues on Egypt, God was simply following the tactics of the Roman army. They shut off the water supply. They made loud noises to confuse and dismay the enemy. Those would be the frogs croaking. They had arrows that they shot. Those would be the gnats. They brought legions in. Those would be the hordes of animals. They tortured the captives. That would be the bubonic plague, Dever. They bombed them with napalm. That sounds like something we did in Vietnam, but the Romans actually knew how to throw napalm from their ballista. And that would be shchin, the boils. They used the catapults. That would be hail. They scaled the walls. Who scales the walls? The locusts. They imprisoned their enemy. That would be darkness. And finally, they executed them, slaying of the firstborn. So the rabbis are very impressed that God anticipated the Roman army's methods of conquest. The Hebrew Bible actually has 2 verses about frogs, and frogs always fascinate me, especially when we have kids at the table. We get little rubber frogs, and we put them hopping around, or wind up spring frogs that hop around. One year I had frogs that were rubber and hollow, and unbeknownst to the kids, the little frog at my place, I filled it with water. And when the kids weren't looking, I would squeeze it and squirt them. And they, what? Where did that come from? And their parents were endlessly annoyed with me. But when the Torah talks about the frogs, it weirdly uses a collective singular. It says, Vata'al hatzvardeya. The frog arose. So Robbie Akiva comes along and says, I'm going to read this rather literally. In fact, there was only one frog. And his rabbis say, Akiva? Really? One frog? He says, yeah. But every time they would hit that frog, new frogs would pop out. And Robbie Eliezer famously says, Akiva, you stick to halacha. We'll do the narrative stuff, okay? So Akiva says, okay, fine. So what do you think? What happened? And they say, well, you are right. There was one frog. But that frog whistled and brought all of his buddies from the Nile. And that's how they filled the not only the streets of Egypt, the houses of Egypt, the beds of Egypt. In fact, one rabbi says that the frogs in some way were the most severe of all the plagues. How bad were the frogs? You could hear the frogs croaking in the bellies of the Egyptians. And what did how do you say, I don't know, I guess, in New York, maybe we say ribbit, I don't know, chug-a-rump. What do frogs say in California? Anybody want to jump in and give me some froggy sounds? The frogs must be very quiet in California. You have tree frogs, that's what we have in Connecticut. They peep. But in Egypt, the sound of the frog is this: kavlakav, 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 which is actually a quote from the Bible, and it means measure for measure. So the sound of the frogs was warning the Egyptians, you will be punished, measure for measure. I also want to say, and I'm saying this because I read it earlier today with a student who I'm studying with. She wanted some new material for Passover. And I studied this from a Midrash called Tana Debe Eliyahu. It's also called Seder Eliyahu Rabbah. Chapter 8, you can look it up. It's in the Meir Ish Shalom, the Meir Friedman edition, page 40. And I'm telling you that because no one ever believes me. They think I'm making this story up. They say, how bad were the frogs? The frogs were so bad that when an Egyptian would go to that outhouse just for a few minutes of peace and quiet, he'd sit down on the toilet seat and a frog would jump out of the toilet and bite him on the behind, right? A real bite in the tuchus. And as the Midrash says, there's just nothing worse than that. So you can take it from Rabbi Visotzky, the frogs were a real bite in the ass. And there it is in the Midrash itself. The Egyptians were also quite nasty. The Jews, of course, hid their children because they didn't want them to be thrown in the Nile. So the Egyptians would send soldiers in, and the soldiers would be holding the baby. And they'd pinch the Egyptian baby, and the Egyptian baby would start to cry. And of course, as soon as one baby starts crying, they all start crying. And that's how they discovered the hidden Jewish children. Kind of a horrifying notion. But there it is. Those Egyptians were such meanies. I think I mentioned that Pharaoh wanted the Jews to not propagate. So he issued a rule that in every Jewish home, in the master bedroom, they had to leave on a nightlight. Pharaoh reasoned that the Jews were such modest people that if they put a nightlight in the bedroom, then they wouldn't have sex and then they wouldn't have Jewish babies. As it turns out, it was okay, even with the nightlight. And that's when God got involved and said, okay, it's going to have to be dark, and brought the plague of darkness. It says in the Bible that the darkness was a heavy darkness. So I ask you, how heavy was the darkness? And the rabbis answer, that darkness was so heavy that literally the Egyptians could not move. It trapped them. It was like a prison. I want to be just a little bit confessional, because there was a time in my life, a long, long time ago, more than probably 50 years ago, that I went through a bout of depression. I was depressed, and I found it very hard to get out of bed in the morning. And I would sit down in a chair, and I found it very hard to move. And that darkness wasn't a metaphor. It was real. And every time I read this Midrash, I'm unfortunately thrown back into that moment in my life. And I think that there's something here that the Egyptians, knowing what they did to the Jews, were smitten with the darkness that literally paralyzed them. Of course, like the blood and the water, the Midrash says that while the Egyptians had darkness, the Jews actually had light. And that turned out to be a great advantage, because the Jews then could go into the home of their masters. And the masters were there trapped in the darkness, while the Jews could use the light they had to quite literally case the joint, find out where they kept the silverware, where were the candlesticks, where did they keep the spare money. And then when the night came for the Jews to leave Egypt, they could go to their Egyptian masters and say, "Oh, I'd like to borrow some silver." And the master would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to give you." And the Jew would say, "Actually, the third drawer on the left over there, if you look, I'm sure you'll find something." And so the plague of darkness kept the Egyptians in bondage and allowed the Jews to take all of Egyptian wealth when they left. Also, the Midrash suggests that while the Egyptians were there in the dark, they heard all kind of noises that terrified them. And if you were ever a kid, I was once, and you remember it, which is a little harder, you may remember lying there in the dark and imagining every noise you hear and magnifying it and thinking, of course, it's the monster under the bed. And this is what the Egyptians suffered. Now, when we get to the sea,
Sorry to interrupt, but
yes,
we can hear the background noise in your house, and people have been noticing that. So I just want to make sure we can hear your wife.
All right, let me just mute for a second. Thank you, Ari. I have to say, I sit here and teach all day long, and my wife is trying to do business, and her clients hear me too. So it's one of those further aspects of the plague of COVID. But she's now moved to the other room. So I was saying that when we got to the Sea of Reeds, we wanted to cross, and there was the sea in front of us. There were the Egyptians behind us, and Moshe holds out his staff, and nothing happens. And he holds out his staff, and nothing happens. And finally, he gets an idea. He says, I'm doing this at the command of God. Wait here a second. And he goes and he takes a stylus, and on the edge of his staff, he writes the letters Yud, He, Vav, He. He writes God's name right there on his own staff. And now when he holds out the staff, Hayam Ra'ah Vayanos. The sea saw God's name on the staff and realized Moses was not there on his own. Moses was there as the Shaliach. He was the messenger of God. And at that point, the sea said, "Oh, I better split." The sea split into 12 rows. You always imagine, because you saw Prince of Egypt, that, it's split like this. But no, it's split like this. Each tribe had its own personalized row. But of course, you realize that the tribes of Israel, they're all related to one another, right? Because they all come originally from Jacob's children. So if I'm going through the wall of water in my tribe, I'm going to wonder what's going on with my cousin Yossi in the other wall of water. So not only did God split the sea into 12 rows, but he put windows in the water so that you could peek through and see how your relatives were doing and not worry. We get through the sea, and we're on the land, and we see the Egyptians drown, and we want to rejoice. Someone yesterday recalled this Midrash. It's a very early Midrash, that not only did the Jews rejoice, we sang the song at the sea, but the angels in heaven wanted to rejoice with them. We would have an angelic chorus. But God rebuked the angels, and God said, my children are drowning in the sea, and you want to sing Hallel? So at least the angels were quiet. But the Jews, well, we were saved from our enemy. We were saved from people who enslaved us. We were so excited that when we sang the song at the sea, even embryos in their mother's belly sang the song at the sea. So when you get to the synagogue on Passover, frankly, any Shabbat, any morning, and you recite the song at the sea, you can imagine the babies in their mother's puppets just singing along with their little high voices. There's actually a disagreement, though, about how they sang the song at the sea. Robbie Eliezer ben Taddai said that Moses would begin a verse, and then the Jews would join in the middle and complete the verse with him. Rabbi Nehemiah said, oh, no. Moses would do a verse, and then they would recite it after he did it. So he'd do it, they do it, he'd do it, they do it. And Robbie Akiva comes along and says, oh, no. Moses did verse A, they did verse B. Moses did verse C, they did verse D, a responsive reading. So those of you who are synagogue Jews, I suspect that all three customs that I have just mentioned take place in your synagogue when they read the Song at the Sea, when they read Exodus 14. And I think it's phenomenal that to this very day, in our synagogues across the country, we replicate all three methods of reading the Song at the Sea that these rabbis in the 2nd century did. I've shared with you quite a number of stories. We have a few minutes left. And I just want to ask if A, you have any questions or comments, or B, any of you have a really nice short story that we can all bring. I'm desperate for new material for my Seder since I've used all this material before. Anybody want to jump in and ask a question, have a comment, a sermonette? I see a name, Mark.
Yeah. Before we get to questions, just a question
please.
for you. So you worked on the Prince of Egypt.
I did.
Correct. And in doing so, I assume that you had to explore different Midrashim and decide, or you were asked to decide what could go in the story. Can you share any behind the scenes stories from that production that you were involved with, or any challenges or successes you had?
I did say I would do that. And I have to say that I worked for quite a number of months, a long time, with Jeffrey Katzenberg. And Katzenberg stood there in the DreamWorks studio, nonstop drinking Diet Coke. And I really began to wonder whether he was bringing me out there, I and another colleague, Everett Fox, whether he was just going to put our names on the credits and do what he damn well pleased. And after 2 months, I came in. They had storyboards across, like you can see the beam here. They would have cartoonists draw the story. I came and he said, I want to show you a rough cut of some of the cartoons, the animated feature. That's a story. I once said to Jeffrey, it's a great cartoon. And he said, pulling himself up to his 5'2", Rabbi, it's not a cartoon. Disney does cartoons. We are doing an animated feature. So I don't want to make that mistake again. We did this animated feature, and there on the screen were things that I suggested. If you've seen Prince of Egypt, I even got to write one line myself of Prince of Egypt. The Jeff Goldblum, Aaron character, says to Moses, as he leads them out of Egypt, he says, quote, thank you, unquote. That was my line. I did not get a screenwriting credit, but you know, I showed up for the Academy Awards that year, garnished, not even a red carpet. But they did split the sea for us. So that was great. And so many of the things that are in Prince of Egypt are, in fact, directly from Midrashim. But to Katzenberg's credit, like when when Thomas Mann wrote his famous novel, Joseph and His Brothers, Katzenberg read everything he could find in English. He read Christian material, he read Muslim material, and he had me use my interreligious context to bring ministers, priests, imams out to DreamWorks Studio in Glendale to see it and make sure that he didn't offend anyone. He didn't want there to be offense. What he wanted was to be a celebration of the Exodus. And I dare say, I'm of a generation where my parents grew up seeing Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments. And my kids and everybody they know grew up seeing Prince of Egypt. And we really, I think, produced something that rivals in its own bizarre way the Passover Haggadah for retelling the story. So if you have kids at home, watch Prince of Egypt. But do know that really little kids will get frightened because there are parts of the story that are frightening. And that maybe is as it should be. But, you can always give them a little wine and they'll be fun.
There's a show we've featured on CSP called The Jews Are Coming, Hayudim Bayim, which is a parody show in Israel that creates problems because of the humor. But I do enjoy their shows.
It's laugh out loud funny, yes.
Yes. Have you seen the one where they're crossing the sea and they get to the other side and everyone is celebrating, but one guy's not celebrating because he can't find his wallet. He thinks he left his wallet in the sea. And what happens? And he wants Moses to split the sea again so he can go find his wallet. Anyway, I'll share it with everybody. It was very funny.
Great.
It's a very good one. So that's a good one, worth sharing with friends before the holiday. And then someone asked a question about the name Hyrcanus. So obviously Hyrcanus is not a Jewish name. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Is that? Do we know many Jews named Hyrcanus, or is this a example?
You're absolutely spot on. You think that Hyrcanus is, and you're correct, a Greek name. But Hyrcanus is Greek like Goldberg is German. Most of us, if we hear someone is named Goldberg, we assume they're Jewish. And in the ancient world, if someone heard the name Hyrcanus, which was a name of the Maccabees, people assumed, yeah, they're Jewish. So it was a Greek name, but a nice Jewish Greek name. And we have to reckon with the fact that there are these Greek names in Pirkei Avot, in the Midrash. Rabbis had names like I have the name Visotzky. It's not necessarily a Jewish name, but there you are.
There was another question about Moses missing from the Haggadah. Do we have evidence of the rabbis discussing this? Because it seems like we don't have that. The rabbis never discussed it. It's just Moses is not in the Haggadah. The rabbis, the Haggadah is discussed, I assume, between the rabbis, what goes in, what goes out, how it's going to lay out, what's going to be in there, maybe not. Maybe I'm incorrect in that assumption. Maybe there's no discussion about the Haggadah at all. But I guess the question is there a discussion about the Haggadah? And if so, why is there no discussion about Moshe at all? So
first of all, and I think somebody put this in the notes, I think there is one scant reference to Moses in passing in the Haggadah. But it's clear to us, to me, that they left him out on purpose. And when the rabbis do things like that, they wisely do not include their editorial notes. The redaction, the editing of rabbinic literature is the stuff that scholarship has been made of for the last 100 years. We all make our reputation and get tenure trying to figure out why the book looks the way it does, because the rabbis never tell us that.
People are also very upset that you have renamed Shifra and Pua, Yocheved and Miriam. They want to know, was there a different Shifra and different Pua and Yocheved and Miriam, or were Shifra and Pua, according to the rabbis, alternate names for Yocheved and Miriam? So
we hear Shifra, we hear Pua, and they, in fact, are exactly equated. It's almost as though to say that Miriam and Yocheved were their Hebrew names, and Shifra and Pua were their Egyptian names. It's like, I always put my name out there as Bert, but when I'm called up to the Torah, I am Baruch. So I guess Miriam and Yocheved, we know them by their Hebrew names. But for those of you that know them personally or love them as they are, you can call them Shifra and Pua. And I know that there are Jewish women. I have somebody in my synagogue who is a great Jewish activist named Shifra. So it has become a nice Jewish name as well. I don't know any Puas.
I don't either. So the Haggadah that you showed us, which I happen to have a copy of, the graphic novel, I was showing it to my kids this morning. There was some scary stuff in there, so I was trying to, but they wanted to see a picture of Moses, and I was like, I bet you he's not in here. So even though it is a graphic novel, I assume that Moses is not in here at all, right? Or is he in here? You're in there.
I did show you yesterday that there is this great thing of this kid taking a selfie as they exodus from Egypt.
Right. I guess Moses is kind of in there, right?
Right there is Moses.
And it's you. Yeah.
Oh, right, not Moses. Never mind. Okay.
So,
So with that, I'm going to end. I will see you all tomorrow. And tomorrow, we're actually going to study the Haggadah text and try and figure out how the rabbis tell this story in their very unusual fashion.
great. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today as we do our CSP prep for Pesach. You can go back to cleaning your kitchens now and cooking. If my mom's on, she's probably cooking. And she historically, I don't think she has anymore, had a separate kitchen for Pesach, which always made life easier for her. For the rest of us, we have to kosher our kitchen, somehow cook for our families now and in 2 weeks. Good luck, everybody. Take care. And looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
See you all tomorrow.
Bye.